Hello again. We're going to talk about elements of the crime. What do we mean when we say elements of the crime? We're talking about taking a criminal statute, whether it's money laundering, a corruption statute, illicit enrichment, whatever the statute may be. We're going to take this statute, we're going to read it very, very carefully, and we're going to extract from there the things that need to be proven, sometimes called the elements of the crime, or the ingredients, or the parts of the statute. So we're going to dissect the criminal statute, and we're going to decide what needs to be proven. Why are these important? Why is it critical that we prove the elements of the crime? Because it's critical to prove each element so that we can assure that we get a conviction. Because every criminal statute can be broken down into these various parts. And each of these parts has to be proven. If we don't prove it, we're not going to get a criminal conviction. So it's very important that we first identify each of these elements and then make sure we have the proof to establish each one of them. Not only is it going to assist you in proving the criminal violation, but it's going to help you in establishing the trail and the proof necessary to seize assets at the conclusion of your case and to confiscate these assets. And not just seize and confiscate, but also to recover them. As I'd mentioned in the previous lecture, a foreign jurisdiction that receives a mutual legal assistance request from you, if you haven't established that linkage through proof, they may not cooperate with you. So it's very important to help you in the establishment of the proof you need to seize, confiscate, and repatriate these assets. So it's going to facilitate your mutual legal assistance in many, many ways. Let's take a look at a quote. And this is directly from the Times of Zambia. Very interesting. It says, a Lusaka Magistrates Court has acquitted former President Frederick Chiluba of 6 counts of theft by a public servant. The High Court Deputy Registrar, in delivering the 6-hour judgment, stated that the prosecution team failed to prove the ingredients of the case against Dr. Chiluba on all the counts. How important is that? This was an extremely high-level, high-profile case. We want to make sure that all of our evidence is organized and ready for trial. And if we fail to prove one of the ingredients, it may be because we didn't first dissect those criminal violations and make sure that we understood each element and make sure that we had the proof for each of these. So as you can see in this very important case, unfortunately the case was lost because each ingredient or element was not proved. It's absolutely critical that we prove them, and the first step in proving them is first in identifying them. So how do we do that? How do we break them down into their various steps? That's one of the things we're going to learn this afternoon, okay? But before we take a look at one particular statute, let's look at the international standards for some of these statutes that you're going to be using, not only during this particular training program, but in real life, in your real cases. The UNCAC provides us, the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, commonly referred to as the UNCAC, provides us with the model language for a number of different criminal statutes relating to corruption and money laundering. The model language, as you can see on this particular slide, is contained in Articles 15, 18, 20, and 23 relating to these various criminal violations. And the UNCAC has said that each party to the convention should adopt the language used in these model statutes through domestic legislation and make these criminal violations within their own individual countries. So we'll use this model language to dissect the language of a particular statute, and we're going to look specifically at the money laundering statute that we find in Article 23, and also Secondly, we'll look at Article 15 and look at the language provided for bribery of national public officials. And we'll see if we can identify the elements of the crime. What do we have to prove? And we'll talk a little bit about how to prove some of these elements also. But before we look at the language of those statutes, let's first look at a definition of what is money laundering. I think money laundering is probably one of the most misunderstood concepts in law throughout the world. And we're going to take some of the mystery out of that in the next 5 minutes. We're going to make it very easy to understand. And how are we going to make it easy to understand? Very simply, by looking at the elements of the crime. But let's first think about what would your definition be of money laundering? Think for just a moment. If I asked you, please define money laundering for me, what would you say? I think many of you would probably come up with a very similar definition. And let's look at a definition that's provided for us on a website that's hosted by the Financial Intelligence Unit for the United States, which is called FinCEN. And they provide us with a very detailed definition of money laundering. And I'll read this. And I'm guessing that this definition is really somewhat similar to what you would tell me if you could respond right now. It says money laundering is the process of making illegally gained proceeds, dirty money, appear legal, that is clean. Typically it involves 3 steps: placement, layering, and integration. First, the illegitimate funds are furtively introduced into the legitimate financial system. That's the placement portion. Then the money is moved around to create confusion, sometimes by wiring or transferring through numerous accounts. They refer to that as the layering portion. Finally, it is integrated into the financial system through transactions until the dirty money appears clean. The integration portion. Now, this is a great definition. I think it's very complete. I think it's very accurate. But is it useful for you when you initiate a criminal prosecution for money laundering? Is this definition useful? Is the court going to want you to prove the 3 ingredients they talk about here? Placement, layering, and integration? Well, I can tell you that I've reviewed the money laundering statutes for probably 40 or 50 countries throughout the world. That's like a quarter of the countries in the world. And I have never, ever seen the 3 terms, placement, layering, or integration, in any of those statutes. So this is a very good definition, but it's what I would call a generic definition. It's not really useful for what you and I are going to be doing. What are you and I are going to be doing? What are we going to be doing? We're going to be working criminal investigations on corrupt officials, trying to put them in jail and confiscate all the illegal proceeds. So when we talk about the activities that we're involved in, the legal system, the criminal legal system, then we have to ask ourselves the question again, what is money laundering from a legal standpoint? Because that's what we need to know. This is a nice definition if you want to tell your friends about money laundering. But if you want to tell the judge about money laundering and present your evidence, you're going to need to know what is money laundering from a legal perspective. So we ask you the question again, what is money laundering? In this case, the answer is extremely simple, and the definition is much shorter. Money laundering is what the law says it is. Short and sweet. It's nothing more, it's nothing less. Money laundering is what the law of your country says it is. Is money laundering in your law the same as money laundering in Switzerland or money laundering in the United States? No, it's not. Why? Because each of those countries has a slightly different money laundering statute. So money laundering is what the law of your country says it is. And how do we go about finding out what that is? It's a very simple process. Remember I said, we're going to take the mystery out of money laundering. It's not going to be the most misunderstood concept in the world anymore. It's going to be very simple. We simply read the statute that relates to money laundering in your country, we read it closely, and then we dissect that into the elements of the crime. What do we have to prove? And that's what money laundering is in your country. It's those elements. That's what has to be proven. So for our example here, since our audience comes from a variety of different countries, we're going to select the language that's contained in Article 23 of the UNCAC, the model language that is recommended for each country that's a signer of the UNCAC to adopt through domestic legislation. And if we look closely at this, we can see that there's actually 3 different money laundering statutes contained in Article 23. The first one relates to conversion or transfer of property. The second one relates to concealment or disguise of the property. And the third one relates to the acquisition, possession, or use of the property. These are 3 completely different money laundering statutes, or I should actually say model language for money laundering statutes. For our purposes, we're going to choose just one of these statutes, or model language. And we're going to choose number 1. So if we look at the slide, let's read this carefully. Keeping in mind, this is the model language suggested by UNCAC that each country that's a signer should enact this type of language for their domestic legislation. Let's read this and think about what has to be proved. It says, the conversion or transfer of property, knowing that such property is the proceeds of crime, for the purpose of concealing or disguising the illicit origin of the property, or of helping any person who is involved in the commission of the predicate offense to evade the legal consequences of his or her action. That's the specific language of this statute. What do we have to prove? What are the elements? Let's look at it again very carefully and break it down. The first element that we can identify is the conversion or transfer of property. Now that's an interesting element because you're going to find that most money laundering statutes in the world start with a similar language, the conversion or transfer or a transaction. And you're going to find that money laundering violations are what I like to call transactional based. In other words, they're all based on the first element, the transaction. And as we go through each of these elements, I'm going to show you more specifically what I mean, because this is a very, very important concept to understand. Identifying the transaction first is the first step in starting your money laundering case, because they're transactional based statutes. So the first element is the conversion or transfer of property. Generically speaking, that would be some sort of transaction. What's the second element that we can find? A transaction with proceeds of crime. Remember we talked about that money laundering statutes are transactional based? So we started with identifying the transaction, and that's exactly what we should do in a real case. We should identify the specific transaction that we're charging. Mr. Corrupt Official had a transaction from this bank account on this date with this amount of money, and it was a wire transfer to another bank. Identify that very specific transaction, the bank, the account, the date, the amount, and where it went. So you see, when it says the proceeds of crime, that's the second element. We need to prove that the money involved in that specific transaction that I just described came from proceeds of crime. So we don't want to prove there was a transaction here, and over here, disjointed, there was money that the person earned through an illegal activity. Just showing these two in a vacuum is not going to suffice. We have to show that these proceeds were involved in this transaction. So money laundering offenses are generally transaction-based. You'll see as we go through the rest of the elements, everything relates back to the transaction. Okay, so the next element, we would want to prove that the person conducted this transaction knowing that such property is the proceeds of crime, the knowledge requirement, the mens rea. We have to make sure that this person had knowledge. What did he have knowledge of? Not that he had knowledge that just there was illegal activities being conducted. No, transactional based. We have to prove that that person had knowledge that this transaction involved these proceeds of crime. So now we're tying elements 1, 2, and 3 together, all leading back to the transaction. And what's the fourth element here? In this particular model statute, we talk about a purpose. The purpose is the fourth element. So the first element was a transaction. Second element was that transaction had to involve proceeds of crime. Third element, the person conducting it or directing it had to know the money was from an illegal activity. The fourth element is we have to prove there was a purpose in this transaction. And the purpose stated in this particular model language says it was either one of two things. It was either for the purpose of concealing or disguising the illicit origin of the property, and that's the normal thing that we're going to be able to prove, that the transaction was involved, that involved a purpose of concealing. But if we don't have that evidence, then the statute provides another purpose that we could prove. It says, or of helping any person who is involved in the commission of the predicate offense to evade his or her legal consequences. So we have to prove one of those two purposes. As I mentioned, in most real cases, the concealment element is the one that you're probably going to be proving. Let's take a look at these elements now. If we put them in little boxes and make it simple to identify, we can see first element is conversion or transfer, some sort of transaction. Second element, with the proceeds of crime. That transaction had to involve proceeds of crime. The third here, there had to be a purpose to conceal or help somebody else evade their legal consequences. And the fourth, the person conducting the transaction had to have knowledge that that particular transaction involved proceeds of crime. So we put this in nice little boxes so we can clearly see what the elements are, but more importantly, what needs to be proved. What needs to be proved is each one of these elements. Now, I keep mentioning the model language in the statute. So I ask you the question, if your country does not have a money laundering offense, or if it's not a strong statute, can you then take Article 23 of the UNCAC and use this to prosecute an individual in your country? Is it a statute that can be used? It's in the UNCAC. The answer is no. Why not? Why is this? It's a beautiful statute, has great language. Why can't it be used? Because there's no penalty provision in the UNCAC. No penalty that says if a person does this, they will face a criminal sentence of at least 3 years in jail or 5 years in jail. There is no penalty clause, so it cannot be a criminal statute without a penalty clause. So these words in the UNCAC are only model language. They're the model language for suggested statutes that each country, according to the UNCAC, should enact through domestic legislation to make these operational in their country. Okay. Another item that I think is very important that we make sure everybody understands. If we look at the wording in this particular statute or model language in the UNCAC paragraph 1, we see the conversion or transfer, knowing that such property is proceeds of crime. We have to ask ourselves the question, if that's an element that we have to prove, proceeds of crime, what crime are we talking about? What crime does the money have to come from? We call this the predicate offense. And each domestic criminal money laundering statute should then provide us with a definition of what do they mean by proceeds of crime. There's got to be a definition section somewhere that tells us that. And all countries do not use the term proceeds of crime. There can be a variety of phrases that can be used for this similar meaning of the proceeds of crime. It could be property derived from an illegal activity. It could be funds from illicit activities. In the United States, the term is specified unlawful activities. And throughout the world, there are many, many different terms that refer to the predicate offenses. So first we have to understand that there's a variety of terms. The second thing that's very, very important is we have to find in the statute, or at least somewhere in the money laundering law, a definition section that's going to tell us what are the proceeds of crime? What are they referring to? In other words, what are the predicate offenses? When we talk about predicate offenses, we're talking about what is the criminal activity that produced this illegal income, and then this illegal income was used in some subsequent transaction. That's the predicate offense. And not every criminal violation in a country's penal code may be a predicate offense. So we have to look at that definition section and find out what are the predicates for that country. Again, going back to the definition, what is money laundering? It's what the law of your country says it is. So we need to make sure we know this section of the law. What are the predicate offenses? So we go to the definition section, and what we're going to find is countries will define the predicate offenses in two different ways. The first is what I call the all crimes approach, and the second is what I call the list approach. So if they use the all crimes approach, it can be further broken down into two more types of predicate offense definitions. The first may say the definition of proceeds of crime is all criminal violations contained in the penal code of the country of Hypotheca. That's simple. Now we know any crime committed that produced income and they have a transaction with it, that's a potential money laundering offense. An all crimes approach. You can also have an all crimes approach with a little limitation. And that limitation is normally a minimum penalty. How would that particular definition read? It would say something to the effect of all criminal offenses in the penal code of Hypotheca that carry a minimum sentence of at least 2 years in prison. Now we have an all crimes approach, but with a limitation. So that would be another way that the definition of a predicate offense could be established in the law. The other method of establishing or defining the predicate offense is what we call the list approach. We can have two different types of lists. One I call the short approach, the short list, and the long list. For example, a country may say proceeds of crime is defined as these specific criminal offenses found in the Penal Code of Hypotheca, Article 45, 86, 295, and so on. And they might list 10 or 12 different offenses. That would be a short list. And there are a few countries that use that. Other countries may use a list approach, but have a very long list. An example of that is the United States money laundering law. They call it not proceeds of crime, but they call it specified unlawful activity. And you go to the definition section of the law, and you find specified unlawful activity has a list of over 200 different criminal activities, a very long list. So these are the way that countries will define the predicate offenses, either the all crimes approach or the list approach. Very important that we find the definition, read it, and understand it, because when we're proving our money laundering offense and we're proving the element that the money came from proceeds of crime, we need to make sure that it's one of those crimes that's listed as a predicate offense in the law. Goes back to the basic point. What is money laundering? It's what the law of your country says it is. Okay, the merger issue, relating again to the underlying criminal activity. This is a very confusing issue in some cases. And it's confusing sometimes to the investigators and the prosecutors because there may be a number of very complicated transactions. But the basic issue is, when does money become proceeds of crime? Remember, we're going to go back to the definition again. The definition says a transaction with proceeds of crime. We already talked about identifying the predicate offense. Now we have to determine, what do we mean by a conversion or transfer of proceeds of crime, or with proceeds of crime? So let's take a look at, when does the money become proceeds of crime? I'm going to ask one of the members of our audience, maybe Eric, to come forward and help me out with this. Eric, how are you doing?
Fine, thank you. And
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
For the moment, I'm going to be a corrupt official. Eric is going to be the owner of a large construction company. Eric, do you want to get this multi-billion-dollar contract?
Of course.
Okay. And are you willing to pay me a little money?
I have it.
Because you know, there's other contractors that want this job.
Yeah,
They want it a lot.
I understand.
So how can you assure that you get the job?
Yep,
Can you assure it by maybe giving me a bribe?
I can try.
Ah, I can try. I like that. Okay, so Eric is the owner of a large construction company. I'm the government procurement official. He's going to give me a bribe now. He's handing me the money. The question is this a money laundering transaction? Let's say we've got this on tape. There's an undercover operation ongoing. We're in a hotel room. It's being filmed. This is marked money. Is this a money laundering transaction? The answer is no. This is the underlying criminal activity. This is the bribe. So this money here is the criminal offense. Now, Eric has taken his hand away. Thank you.
Thank you very
Oh, but don't go away. Don't go away. Come back. I want more money from you.
I didn't know.
So he's given me all this money. If we put it in his hand again, this is the underlying criminal activity. Now, only at this point, am I holding proceeds of the crime. Because the law says a transaction with proceeds of crime. So if I take this money and now I have a subsequent transaction, maybe I buy a diamond ring for my girlfriend. Maybe I buy a new house. Maybe I put it into a bank account that's in a shell company name. These would be transactions with proceeds of crime. That would be potential money laundering offenses, not the underlying criminal activity. This is the proof we need to show where the money came from, but it's the subsequent transactions that are money laundering offenses. Eric, can I keep this?
Of course, it's for you.
Ah, okay. Well, you're being far too kind. So we give you this back. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you very much.
appreciate it. Okay, so that's what we commonly call the merger issue. It's very important to identify what is a money laundering transaction as opposed to the actual underlying criminal activity. We're going to look at one more statute very quickly here see if we can identify the elements. Again, this is from the UNCAC. It's Article 15. And Article 15 relates to bribery of national public officials. There's really two violations in here. Remember when we looked at the money laundering violations, Article 23, there was 3 separate money laundering violations that they recommend. This has 2. The first one under paragraph A, and the second one under B. Under A, we're talking about the promise or offering or giving to a public official. In other words, the contractor, such as Eric, he's the one doing the bribing. That statute would be directed at him. B is directed at me, the corrupt official, the solicitation or acceptance. You saw me accept the money from Eric by a public official. So B is the one that we'll take a look at and see if we can extract the elements of the crime. Let's just take a moment and read it very carefully. And I'll read it out loud. And then we'll look at the elements. The solicitation or acceptance by a public official, directly or indirectly, of an undue advantage for himself or herself or another person or entity, in order that the official act or refrain from acting in the exercise of his or her official duties. Again, let's take that statute, think about it, break it down into the parts that have to be proven. When I see a new statute, I'm working with a country and I haven't looked at their laws before, I take these statutes and I sit down and I print them out and I circle each element as I read it closely to make sure that I understand and think I can identify each element. Well, we're going to do a similar thing here, only we're going to just put them in a box again, just like we did with the money laundering ones. And here we have 3 elements for this statute, 3 things that need to be proven for this bribery of a national public official. The first one is the solicitation or acceptance of an undue advantage. You just saw it when Eric handed me the money. He was giving me money, an undue advantage, something that I did not deserve. And I was soliciting it from him. You heard me do that. And then you saw me accept it. So we had the acceptance of an undue advantage. What was the undue advantage? The money that he gave me. So that's element number 1. By a public official. That was me, a public official. Many times, people think that the definition of a public official is very simple and we don't need to pay a lot of attention to that. But in fact, that's a critical point because many laws in a variety of countries, when they give a definition of a public official, they exclude certain classes of officials. Some countries actually exclude the president, the ministers, maybe the prime ministers from the public official definition. So we need to make sure that the person that you're investigating falls under the definition of a public official for this particular violation. And the third element is that this acceptance of money by the public official had to be in order for the public official to do or fail to do something that was relating to his official duties. It says, in order that the official act or refrain from acting in the exercise of his or her official duties. So these are the elements of this crime. It only takes a moment to read the statute carefully, extract the elements, and then base your investigation on proving each of these elements. If you have any questions at all, you know you can use that tab that we talked about, the message tab. Send us your emails, send us your questions. If I haven't been clear on something, we'll certainly attempt to answer all of your questions. Okay, at this point, we'd like each group to go back to working their simulated case. Continue to follow the leads, continue to fill out your evidence log so you make sure that you're organized. And send us those requests through the message tab, telling us the things that you want to do, the investigative actions that you want to take. So good luck, and we'll be back in a while.